Reverend Stephen Minnema, did I say that right? Was a Presbyterian pastor for 45 years, and in his semi-retirement has served as an interim pastor for local Lutheran churches, as well as teaching courses in religious studies and ethic programs at Viterbo University. He has been regularly going down to Colombia, where he offers support to Presbyterian congregations who are working for social justice. And he's going to be our guest speaker today. So welcome. Come on up.
Thank you. Is that too loud or is it working? It works okay. Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to reflect with you on my recent experience of Colombia. I just returned a week ago from my 6th visit to that country. The part of Colombia that I visit is called Urabá. It's a region in the north-central part of the country, a poor region. It has some cities, but many rural areas, and we visit all of them. Urabá was the scene of much violence during the long civil war in Colombia that raged for so many years. And that means that the Presbyterians, the congregations that I visit down there, are full of survivors of violence. Colombia has one of the highest populations of displaced people in the world. During the violent years, the paramilitary or the guerrillas would come into a community and say, "We're taking this over, leave. You have till tomorrow to leave." And if they didn't, they were shot. And so waves of people relocated in all sorts of ways. And the Presbyterians, the people that I visit down there, are the survivors of this kind of bullying. And what's always impressed me about them is that their spirit hasn't been broken, nor has their capacity for compassion. They continue to see themselves as responsible for showing compassion to others who are being displaced and broken by the many bullies in Colombia. So as I went down there this year, with my heart heavy because of our own bully on the throne here in this country, I knew that I wanted to address the question of how do we live faithfully under the reign of a bully. And I think maybe you find this a relevant question as well. So I have to write a sermon when I go down there. This time I preached it 9 different times in 2 weeks. So I got quite familiar with it, and I want to share a little bit about what I talked about in that sermon on this question. It was inspired about 2 days after our election last fall. I was really disheartened by the results of that election, as I'm sure most of you were as well. And I went to a gathering, a fundraiser, and we were all seated around a big table, and there was a woman, an older woman. She must have been in her 80s. She sat there. She didn't stand at all, but she had a homemade button that she'd made herself and was wearing, and it really spoke to me. The button said, "Desperation is not an option." And I took that a little bit further. Not only is desperation not an option, but what's needed as we live under this bully is fresh experiences of joy. Because, I think you understand this, if we let desperation take over our lives, our souls, our hearts, the bullies win, right? The bullies win. And the converse of that is that the best resistance is resistance that's fueled by joy, right? Okay. So where do we find joy under the reign of a bully? That was the question that I posed to myself in this sermon that I wrote for Colombia and that I want to share with you a bit. And of course, these were Christian congregations, so I had to go to the New Testament for this wisdom, and I hope you Unitarians will understand and appreciate that. Because some of these old documents have a lot of wisdom in them that we neglect at our peril, right? And here I'm going to let you in on a little secret, not well known, especially among Christian congregations. The original Jesus movement was a resistance movement. Before the church took it over and made it into something else entirely. So there's a lot, as we think about resistance today, that we can learn from the New Testament. And let me give you a brief summary of the main lesson here about joy, finding joy under the reign of a bully. The main lesson is you find joy when you glimpse a new world not dominated by bullies being born. That's where the joy comes. Okay, so, but what are the signs that we're looking for of that new world being born? So, first of all, let me tell you about a verse that has become so meaningful to me after the election. It's a verse from the first chapter of Mark, where we first see Jesus stepping on the scene. And the verse says something like this. After John the Baptist had been arrested, Jesus stepped forth to say, now is the time. The reign of God is near. Imagine that. Herod had arrested John in order to squash all opposition to his reign. The bully had asserted himself, and the disciples of John must have been as disheartened as we were after the election. The bully reigns. The bully is going with vengeance against his enemies. But it was just at that very moment Jesus stepped up to say, now is the time. A better world is being born. A world of compassion, a world of justice, a world of community, one with another. I think Jesus was saying, now it's become real clear what our choice is. The life of the bully, the spirit of the bully, or something far different. But what's interesting to me is that when he announces this, Jesus says, the first words out of his mouth are repent. Now, I know that's a freighted word for lots of us, but what Jesus is really saying in this context is, all right, this resistance movement starts with self-examination. How have we contributed to this world? How have we been a part of creating a world of a society that's so divided against itself? How have we been a part of that? You know that the MAGA people are completely resistant to taking a hard look at themselves, at our history, and seeing what needs to change. So when you see us, when you see others, willing to take a hard look at ourselves and saying, what have I done to make this world come into existence, to give this bully credibility? Then we can take a certain joy. Because the new world is being born through self-examination. Another verse I want us to look at that I think is critical to what Jesus is about is from the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, because they will be satisfied. Think about it. What is at the heart and soul of our desire to resist the bullying that we're seeing right now? What is motivating us the most? If you're like me, it's hunger for justice. I talked about this in my sermon. I talked about the fact that in my own personal life, that hunger for justice was first developed as I watched my dad come home from work every day, abused by his employers, not paid well, and sent to an early death because he was forced to work with chemicals during those years. And that seeing my dad's suffering at their hands planted in my soul a hunger for justice. And I suspect my people in Colombia were listening very carefully because they'd all been subject to the same thing. Where have you acquired that hunger for justice? And even now, I can hardly talk about it, but it's so disheartening, so disturbing to see billionaires withholding aid from poor countries. God, does it make you hunger for justice? But here's what Jesus said, blessed are those who hunger for justice. It doesn't feel blessed, does it? It feels hard. But what Jesus is saying is, blessed are you because you're ready for something else. You're longing for something else, and you'll put yourselves into it. So blessed, take joy in that hunger for justice. All right, so the third passage that I want us to look at is another passage in which Jesus is talking, and he says to his disciples, the way the world works, the rulers of the nations, those who have power, abuse and exploit others. But it must not be so among you. Leadership in the resistance movement, to borrow a phrase from Viterbo, is servant leadership, not bully leadership. And so just to give you one small example, 2 days after the election of a bully here in this country, I got an email from one of my correspondents in Colombia, a pastor down there. And he said that he would be spending the day working in the fields of a man who was sick and couldn't work them himself. And my heart rejoiced because the spirit of the bully was resisted and replaced with the spirit of the servant. When you see that happening, there's joy there, isn't there? Then another passage that I want to mention is a passage from Luke where John the Baptist is in prison, and he's worried about what Herod is doing, the bully Herod. And he sends his disciples to Jesus, and he says, how do we know that you're the one who's going to lead us in a different direction than what this bully is doing? And Jesus says to John's disciples, go back and tell John, the sick are healed, the blind obtain their sight, the poor have good news to preach to them. In other words, what Jesus is saying to John's disciples is, all the victims of this bully are finding compassion and healing and good news with me. When I got to this passage down in Colombia, I told my friends down there, I said, I want to tell you a secret. This is why I come back every year, because I see you caring for the displaced, the marginalized, and I see it as a sign that the reign of God is near. And I would suggest that in the same way as we in this society circle around and support those who are being victimized by this bully, we can also get a glimpse of a new world being born. And then one other, if we can rejoice in that. And then one other passage I want us to look at is a passage one of the most powerful passages in all the New Testament, I think. It's as Jesus is dying on the cross, and there's a Roman soldier standing there who looks at all of this and says, this man truly was the Son of God. Now, that might not mean a lot to you, but put it in context. If that soldier or anybody standing there had pulled a coin out of his pocket, he would have read on that coin, Caesar is the Son of God. So see what this man is saying? He's saying, I see in this one of self-giving love, I see the true way forward that I don't see in the bully on the throne. And maybe we can hope that the same kind of conversion can happen, will happen, is happening among those who have supported this bully when they see that what he is actually doing is continuing the bullying ways of Caesar and not showing us toward a better world. In fact, one of the few joys to come out of this time for me is that my two brothers, who have long been traditional, hard and fast Republicans, have now joined me in resistance. It happens. So the message this morning is this: you can take joy when you glimpse a new world morning. And I want to conclude by telling you one of the high experiences from Colombia where I got such a glimpse. There's a little community there called Santa Fe Las Platas that we visit. It's in the mountains. It's actually in a region of the country that the government can't reach. And so it's under the effective rule of the paramilitary organization in that area. That's this little spot. Well, this church there, those of us who've been part of this mission for a while, helped this community to purchase a field about 2 miles from their church where they could grow their crops and where they could also plant chocolate so that they would get some resources for their church to be able to continue. And they called this field, we visit it every year when we go down there, they called it Tierra del Esperanza, the field of hope, the land of hope. So we visited again this year, and a bunch of us, people from the church, and then the delegation from the States, the two of us who were there for that. And then they loaded up all their supplies on mules, and up the mountain we went, and down into the land of hope. And then they took us to this tree, and we sat down, and they built a bench so that we would have a place to sit on. And then they started a couple fires, and they started cooking our meal there. And we had conversations with one another about how grateful they were for this land that had brought such a gift to this community. And we sat there enjoying fellowship with one another as the meal cooked. And finally, the meal was cooked. It's called sancocho. It's a special traditional Colombian meal that's basically a soup with lots of vegetables and chicken pieces here and there. And we sat there under that tree, eating our bowls of sancocho, looking around at that field. And someone who was sitting next to me whispered in my ear, "This is the reign of God." What joy that brought me and everyone there to say, even under the reign of the bullies of Colombia, in the midst of the country controlled by the paramilitaries, the reign of God is breaking into the world. What joy. Thank you.